How do you you delicious people? I'm here to review Forever Young. I don't know why I'm reviewing this movie. Hopefully, maybe at some point it could be justified of why I reviewed this film. Because at the end of the day, it's a very romantic film. Ultimately, it's kind of a just really just a journey of a person that forcibly decides to otherwise freeze himself to eventually be put on hold for the woman he loves. So when going into this movie, there's like a sci-fi element, and then there's ultimately the romantic element as well. There's also kind of very much like you could ultimately say that this movie is quasi a time travel film, but when looking at it, kind of isn't. So yeah, it's just like, well, it's technically time travel, but technically not. But anyways, it's just a man that basically it's kind of the Captain America approach of like a man out of time, and now he has to reconnect with people that had probably not realized or had completely had to forget about him because they didn't know where he was. So ultimately, a lot of people had died during this time. So this and that one and whatever one have you. So going into this, let's talk about this movie. So we have it to where reasonably Daniel like quickly makes an adjustment to be able to adjust to this time and ultimately try to figure out how to track down people to ultimately lead him to like seemingly figure out some way to ultimately get a connection to be able to reconnect to things, luckily enough. But all while that is also happening, the government is right around his tail to ultimately come after him to ultimately just say, hey, like we want to examine you, we want to figure out what happened, and we want to know like all about these procedures and everything like that because hey, like we are people who are, of course, cryogenic stasis people. So, hey, we want some information about this project that ultimately had supposedly gone well, technically, barely, maybe. So, anyways, let's go out of our way to talk about this film in a very uncryptic like form. Ultimately, yeah. Reasonably, we have it to where Mel Gibson is a test pilot. Ultimately, not a fighter pilot, just a test pilot. So ultimately, like, there's kind of some mixtures of some like it's like a Captain America, but it's also kind of like if Green Lantern never if it was a like a barely Green Lantern-ish like thing. Ultimately, there's nothing superhero about this movie. It's all romantic and gushy and this and that, and ultimately, more than likely, any number of people probably remember this film, but like, this is what this is about. Anyways, so going into Forever Young, I would call this a time travel movie. Ultimately, technically, it's kind of the barest of time travel, but when looking at it, like this movie was done in '92. Back to the Future was done in '85. There was technically, if you want to call time travel shows, there was Quantum Leaps. There was ultimately Quantum Leaps. There was ultimately the Time Machine, which ultimately got rebooted as a movie with Guy Pearce in it. You could check all those out without a doubt. So ultimately, let's go into the spoilers. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we have Elijah Wood in this film. We have Jamie Lee Curtis. Basically, some pretty still stars of this day in a lot of ways. Ultimately, you might have saw maybe a Lord of the Rings movie at some point, or maybe a Halloween movie. Maybe you might be familiar with either one of those series. Ultimately, when going into here, one adjustment that I think I made, I think I thought that like John Goodman was in this film. I guess I was completely wrong about that. George Wendt is in this film. Ultimately, the guy who was from the show Cheers, and ultimately he was, of course, the guy who would usually go on Saturday Night Live as Dubbers. Yeah, of course. So, anyways, going into this movie, we have it to where Mel Gibson ultimately is a test pilot that seems to be going well. We have Harry Finley that ultimately comes to Daniel, who's played by Mel Gibson, and ultimately telling him that the experiment went well. Ultimately, Harry mentions that he has frozen a chicken and had revived it. And so Daniel's like, "Well, that's great. So now I'm just gonna tell my woman that we're gonna get married. Like I'm gonna tell right now." And so ultimately he's like they were at some like get together, and ultimately like Mel Gibson was making like goofy eyes out of cups uh, at this one boy, and then ultimately like Mel Gibson was asking like Helen's like, why is that kid staring at me? And she's like, I don't know. So we're very much at a point in time where ultimately Daniel is trying very much to prep, ultimately telling Helen that they are going to get married. Like he's like, yeah, I'm really wanting to marry this woman. And God, do I just like I like this story just because it's like you you can buy the relate, and then it's like you can buy the relationship, and then when ultimately what happens next is like a kind of moment. So we have it to where Daniel is practicing like ultimately like proposing, saying like, yeah, like I want this woman, I want her, and so like there's no one that's ever going to tell me that otherwise. So justifiably Daniel eventually like is trying to get the words out, but ultimately like, and so reasonably, Helen eventually goes into this telephone booth, and Mel Gibson follows right behind her, and ultimately tells her it's like, can we just stay in this phone booth forever? And so ultimately they kiss. Um, Ultimately, it seems at point in time that Helen eventually gets out of the diner that they're at, and eventually there's an accident that follows, and eventually Daniel ends up walking out of the diner to ultimately see that his wife Helen, or future wife Helen, is ultimately injured. So we find out that Helen ultimately is so injured that she's ultimately in a coma. Uh, and they're not really sure if Helen is ever going to get out of this coma. A lot of people are basically saying that, like, well, more than likely, this is probably like it's not going to work out. More than likely, like, she's not going to come out of this. We ultimately have Harry Finley, who ultimately mentions at some point talking about some new test subjects for his experiment. Ultimately, mentioning that there's one guy that they're kind of pining away for, that ultimately it doesn't really seem like he has much going on with his life. So ultimately, if they end up putting this guy through the procedure, then like ultimately it's completely fine. Ultimately, Daniel tells Harry after very much a long-winded amount of time of just smoking his life away and just drinking away and just ultimately just sealing himself off from everyone. Daniel mentions to Harry, it's like, well, hey, like, how about you freeze me? Freeze me, put me in here. Ultimately, like, Helen right now is in a coma. When she is completely okay, wake me up. So really what ends up happening is, of course, they end up going completely through with this procedure, freezing Daniel until ultimately Helen is coming out of this procedure, because ultimately Daniel has nothing else. All his life is completely 100% tied to Helen, and ultimately, the longer that he's without her, the more heartbroken he becomes. So Daniel goes through this experiment and ultimately wakes up numerous years later, to ultimately find out that reasonably he is woken up by two kids that are just in some military factory somewhere, that is going to be uh, like completely shambled and whatever. It's kind of like the hey, just keep all this crap over here. Ultimately, this experiment was labeled bizarrely as some water heater because nobody really knew what it was. So going into this, we have Elijah Wood's character, who's ultimately played Nat, and Robert High Gorman, who has ultimately played Felix, who ultimately go in and ultimately are just playing around with the stuff bizarrely in some military-esque like base, because there is some um, older military-esque like person that is gone with them, which I'm assuming is Felix's brother. And so ultimately they go into this and they start playing around, which is the worst place to ultimately play around when this makes no sense. But I guess surefire enough. So you have Elijah and you have Nat and Felix who are playing around in this military place, and they're ultimately playing around with the toggles on Mel Gibson's machine. And so ultimately what ends up happening is they keep toggling all of these toggles to unlock Mel Gibson. Nat and ultimately Felix assumed that it was a submarine, so they didn't think that they had any problems with just pressing buttons and pulling doggles or whatever. Because ultimately they just figured that it was just a submarine that was probably taken out of commission. Is when with all of this stuff, supposedly was going to be eventually put all to scrap, or eventually just to be thrown away of, because they didn't have any use for it. So ultimately, Mel Gibson eventually wakes from his procedure, grabs Nat's jacket, and ultimately Elijah Wood is freaking out because he doesn't know what this is, and so is Felix, so they run away. Ultimately, what ends up happening is Mel Gibson eventually gets out of this place that he's in, and eventually tries to figure out who to talk to eventually go into refinding Harry again, Harry Finley. Funny enough, we have it to where ultimately Mel is or Daniel is trying to call an operator, and ultimately he doesn't have enough phone numbers because he only has 5 numbers and he needs 7. It's okay, well, I don't know this new phone system. So he ultimately goes back into the military base to ultimately tell them what is all going on. He ultimately tells them exactly his experiment, what had all gone on with that, and ultimately we have a military person that is supposedly writing down everything that this person's saying, but he's just doodling. Ultimately to call a much more higher up official to ultimately probably just get this guy into some crazy place, or a mental hospital somewhere because he's loony. But everything that this guy is saying actually has some real fruition, and so ultimately, whoever is to be on that other end of the phone, ultimately, oh my god, let's bring the FBI in here, let's bring the whoever we need to get to recollect this guy, so otherwise we can find out what had happened with this experiment and if it had gone well. So reasonably, we have it to where Mel eventually is just kind of stumbling around because ultimately, he can't go and explain all this military because they won't believe him. So ultimately, he has this jacket still that is ultimately otherwise tied to Elijah Wood. So ultimately, he finds bizarrely Elijah Wood's address. And here's the thing that I don't quite understand: Mel Gibson's character doesn't have money. How is it that he can seem to afford these taxi trips or something like that? Is he just bumming rides, hitchhiking everywhere that he goes? I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of goofy. But so, anyways, we have it to where eventually Daniel eventually makes his way to Elijah and Felix's treehouse, to where ultimately he mentions to them, it's like, hey, whose coat is this? Ultimately, Elijah confesses that it was his coat. And so we now have them forcibly going into some library, to ultimately we have Mel Gibson eventually figuring out his descendants, his people that he knows, and that ultimately he could figure out some way of contacting. Ultimately, he's trying to contact the Harry Finley character and figure out his next of kin or something like that. There's no ancestry thing going on here where people could easily find out things within this time period. So ultimately, there are some PI investigations via this library lady, and there's a lot of just overall backfires. Consistently, Mel Gibson is going to certain people to be ultimately said that it's like, oh, this isn't the Harry Finley that I know. So every time this person through the library is calling him, it's usually a misfire at some points in time. But then eventually it seems like they're getting more and more closer. So, Elijah is ultimately meeting a girl within the library that he seems to be wanting to be utterly romantically connected to, and ultimately he is hiding himself because ultimately he doesn't want this girl to see him in the library on the weekend, because ultimately she'll probably think that he's a dork or a nerd or something like that. So ultimately, we have it to where Elijah goes to this girl because Felix pushes him into it. And we have it to where he goes to her and he he tells her the worst things, because he ultimately just doesn't know how to talk to girls. And so easily we have to where Elijah just mentions to the girl, it's like, oh, we're you look really nice today. It's like, yeah, the dress you're wearing, it looks like wallpaper. And she's like, huh? And he's like, yeah, I wrecked my bike today. Yeah, and I got a big scar on my leg, or a big scrape on my leg. And she's like, yeah, okay. And ultimately he's talking about her, he's talking about her nail polish, that it's red like blood. And he's saying all the worst things he could possibly tell her. And because he doesn't know how to talk to girls, so ultimately he's just like, well, I like this girl, but I don't know how to talk to her. So ultimately we have it to where Mel Gibson and Daniel is just kind of stuck in Elijah Wood's treehouse. Ultimately, Elijah is just telling him, it's like, hey, we'll eventually figure out when we're getting phone calls, eventually the connection to your ancestor or people, your people of your past. So, just kind of stay in this treehouse until we get some phone calls and we'll see what happens. So, we have it to where eventually Jamie Lee Curtis comes home. She's evidently a nurse in this movie, and she ultimately brings home a pretty bad amigo, a person that we barely know, and we will barely care who he actually is, because ultimately it seems like this person is a bad boyfriend that ends up kind of just almost being too aggressive. Daniel ends up spotting this. He ultimately runs into the house and eventually saves this woman from 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 any kind of fight going on. Ultimately, Daniel mentions that he just supposedly just so happened to be walking by, So wait a minute. He had just been walking by her backyard, because I'm assuming this is her backyard that he was just so happened to be walking by, and heard the commotion from I don't know how, and saved this woman. I guess it's a moot point. It's just kind of a nice, good thing on Daniel's character, and ultimately, it's like it helps Jamie Lee Curtis just kind of easily make friends with this person, and ultimately, eventually help him out in the end. So eventually, we have it to where ultimately Mel Gibson or Daniel ends up hurting his hand because ultimately fighting this guy. So otherwise, Jamie Lee Curtis takes care of it because ultimately she's like, "Yeah, this is a gash. Like this is really bad. Like you like I'm a nurse. Like I'm gonna take care of you." So ultimately, easily enough, like as soon as like Jamie Lee Curtis basically tells like this guy, it's like, what do you do all the time? Just go ahead and go through everyone's town and just save everybody. And he's ultimately just like, no, I'm a test pilot. So eventually, easily enough, like Elijah Wood eventually goes home and realizes like, hey, why are you in my home? And he's like, dude, I had to save her. Like bad hombres coming in your house. So basically, Elijah is just like, well, my mom is gonna make you like stay here, right? And he's just like, I don't think so. And Elijah's like, you don't know my mom. And so easily we crack open the bed sheets onto the couch. Jamie Lee Curtis is like telling like all about the thermostats and all of this stuff. Basically, we eventually have at some point where like Mel Gibson, Daniel's character, is watching the television, and ultimately Elijah Wood has to mention it's like, oh yeah, this is the television. And Daniel's character or Daniel mentions is like, well yeah, I know what a television is because like I saw one in a like I saw one at a museum or something in 1939. So like they were just kicking off like TVs in 1939. That's kind of interesting. Like they were showcasing it off somewhere. Interestingly enough. So we have it to where ultimately Daniel eventually is getting these turnarounds where ultimately he's not finding the person that he's connected to, and eventually he's starting more and more to bizarrely get this weird kind of like this weird paralysis or this weird just like sickness of sorts. To ultimately we're just like, okay, what is going on with this character? So eventually it ends up that reasonably uh, Daniel's character is really trying to help out around the house, making food, reshingling the roof, this and that. Eventually, finding out that he almost falls off the roof trying to fix the shingles, and because he gets hurt, because ultimately he's having this weird aging process, and so ultimately that's what's going on. Like he's aging, he's acceleratingly aging, and so reasonably that's what's going on. So we have it to where eventually they have it to where these false alarms keep going off to where ultimately he just keeps ending up with Jamie Lee Curtis and her son numerous times, just kind of going into like airplane shows, ultimately going into very much like Daniel is trying to rekindle his past as a fighter pilot, like just just climbing into a plane and just kind of looking around at it and just going, yeah, this looks great. So this is kind of familiar. Ultimately, at some point, Elijah Wood Nat ultimately is asking for Daniel's character to help him, like show him how to fly, and ultimately Daniel says no to that because ultimately he doesn't have a flight jacket, and ultimately he just no. But anyways, I'm like, because Nat eventually mentions how like his father left him when he was really young, and then ultimately like he just wants like some kind of father figure. Because ultimately there is a doctor guy that is quasi maybe going to be his father figure, but like there's some like unsureness about that. So we eventually at some point have Nat eventually get Daniel his fighter or his flight jacket. So ultimately, Daniel does teach Elijah how to fly in a very much tree house simulated like experience that ultimately we're going to bring back up, foreshadowing to what is to happen later in the film. So we have it to where ultimately Daniel goes into this and we have it to where Daniel is more and more getting sick to the point where he has to be rushed to the hospital because ultimately he is getting just really to the point of just being so hurt that and nobody knows how to help him, so they really are just taking him to the hospital at this point. We have the doctor that is ultimately tied to Jamie Lee Curtis uh, because he is dating her at this time, and so reasonably the doctor is looking at Mel's case because he has seen him before at Jamie Lee Curtis's home, ultimately Claire's home. So what happens is that this guy is looking over him and he's like, "Oh my God, how is this person acceleratingly aging? This makes no sense." Going to Claire, trying to be like, "Who is this guy? Because what is happening to him makes no sense." So reasonably, eventually, Claire goes to Daniel, and ultimately, Daniel has to confess what is really and truly going on, and really mentioning that he is a man from a different time. Ultimately, telling her that he just needs to find um, any resemblance of Harry Finley or Helen, a woman that he had loved, and ultimately Claire mentions that there had been some message on her answering machine, and ultimately she didn't think anything of it. So ultimately, we're now having Claire very much getting this guy into a wheelchair to thrust him out of this hospital to get him to this descendant. Ultimately, I don't know how because I don't know how they checked out the answer machine via this course of time, but it ends up just being what it is. More than likely, maybe Claire had heard the answer machine, heard the address, and ultimately, like, that's where they just go from this, and I guess you can convincingly just do that. So, we have it within now the FBI, the government is knowing that this person, all good and well, is here in this hospital because they cranked out through Daniel's DNA to figure out that this guy is this guy in a different time. So, reasonably, the FBI is looking for him, ultimately in this hospital. Claire is telling her doctor boyfriend to stall them to where she's going to try to get him out of this hospital to eventually get him to this Harry or Finley descendant. So they drive all this way to eventually go out of the way to find this descendant of Harry. So this woman has all of these like experimental notebooks. She has a bunch of pictures of the past. Ultimately, ultimately Daniel grabs the photo of Helen that he ultimately knows full well that it is Helen, and ultimately to like say, yeah, this is my woman. So we have it to where Daniel is looking through the old notes of Harry Finley, And basically, the big fat words that end up on the very bottom of the page is that the aging acceleration is permanent. That there's no way to cure this. And ultimately, Harry had probably taken numerous years to try to figure out probably how to solve this, and he couldn't. So reasonably, he just died in the process. So we have it to where ultimately, like, Daniel is just like, well, like, yeah, there's no way, there's I have nothing left now. Like, all I have is these notes, and that's all I have. And all I have is really just this picture of Helen. And ultimately, the girl that is Harry's last descendant is mentioning how reasonably, like, that it's like, oh yeah, I really love that picture, like, because it was me in that picture, and like I was with Helen. And Daniel like looks at her and he's like, how is that possible? Like, she should have been dead before you were like born. And she's like, oh no, I was 2 when that picture was taken. And so ultimately it's like, oh, so she came back from her procedure? And of course the girl is like, well, of course, yes, like, we were taking a picture with together. And ultimately, this last descendant of Harry knows the knowledge to where this Helen is now living. And ultimately, so Daniel is scrambling out of this house to eventually, as quickly as possible, to get into a car to ultimately drive to eventually getting to Helen. Basically, going through a car, then going into a plane that ultimately just steals and commandeers. And eventually, we have it to where Daniel is just going to fly this plane alone. And ultimately, Jamie Lee Curtis ends up going and getting all the sketchbooks, or the books, the notebooks that this Harry Finley had done of this experiment, while eventually the government is kind of hightailing to get to them. And so ultimately, Jamie Lee Curtis is telling these people, hey, like, this guy is eventually going to die. He's gonna eventually age and heal over. So like, what you're doing is kind of pointless. But here is all the textbooks of, here you go. So ultimately you can like refigure out this process and do the math and figure it all out, to where ultimately we have it to where the guy who plays Cameron, who is also the guy who plays Miles Dyson in the Terminator 2 movie Judgment Day, he is ultimately the guy that is the cryogenic guy that is wanting to desperately get to Daniel. He ultimately is going to just let Daniel go, because he's like, well, he's probably going to die anyways, so might as well just let him go. Like, ultimately, there's nothing, like, we have the notes, that's all we need, so justifiably, he can just go about his ways. They'll ultimately eventually pick up Claire's son, Elijah, because ultimately they find out that Elijah is flying the plane with Daniel. Ultimately, it doesn't come down to that at first, because ultimately Daniel is flying the plane, but then Elijah just sits next to him. But then eventually, Daniel starts rapidly aging again, so Elijah has to completely 100% fly the plane, with Daniel like telling him things to do, like in the movie Kick-Ass, where ultimately Nick Cage ultimately is burning alive, and so ultimately justifiably Hit Girl has to be told by Big Daddy what all to do to ultimately like survive through all these processes. So ultimately, Elijah does miraculously land this plane right in front of this person's house, and of course, Mel turns to him. It's like, yeah, you show off. It's like, this is your first ever like time flying, and you just like nail it. Good for you. Like, yeah, like there was a hilarious scene earlier where forcibly Daniel told Nat to cut onions, and so he's cutting the onions, and Nat is just like crying, and Daniel is just laughing, like ha ha ha, like I made you cut these onions and you did it, and now you're crying, ha ha ha, sucks to be you. So, anyways, we have it to where ultimately I'm thinking like I know how this movie goes, but when looking at this, I'm like, what if he just goes to this house and there's nobody there, or ultimately there's just like there's an interesting little beat that like Helen and Daniel did have like a daughter or something like that that ultimately he never knew about. But I don't know how that would work with the whole coma thing. But still, it would be, I don't know, it would be kind of, anyways, it doesn't matter. We ultimately have very much like and again, I don't understand this, but it's a romantic thing. So Daniel is kind of knocking at the house, getting nobody, and then eventually he is just kind of continuously looking throughout the house, and eventually he eventually sees a gal that is about roughly his same age. So we're ultimately led to believe that that is Helen. We're ultimately led to believe that they're hugging together, and to be said that ultimately Daniel is finally saying, "Now are we going to get married?" And she, of course, says yes. So here's my thing: we have a plane that lands at this house, and Helen like maybe doesn't hear anything, doesn't hear anybody appear at her home, and then she's just waiting outside of her house, just kind of just going like chillax and just like, you know what, like, like I, like I'm not gonna deal with any of this. But then we have Daniel eventually coming to her, and then she's like, oh, I guess I should say hello. Maybe she didn't know what to think. Maybe she didn't know what the sound was. I don't know, but I think with that ending, that's the real true ending of this review. That's the ending of the movie. At the end of the day, it's a mushy film. I get it reasonably. I think there's some viable things in this, but it's probably a movie that's done in '92. So yeah, when looking at it, like maybe people know about it, people remember it. Maybe there's a following of this movie. Maybe at some point, people remember bits and pieces about it. Ultimately, there is also a interesting part within this movie that I'm going to backpedal a little bit, where eventually Daniel almost like he ends up locking lips with Claire at some point in this movie, and then Daniel rushes to Nat's character and ultimately tells him that, hey, like, tell this girl, the girl that you're interested in, tell her the honest God truth. Like, tell her what you told me before. Sing to her. And Nat's like, sing? So Nat ends up finding wherever the heck that this girl is, sings to her, "You are my sunshine," and then eventually, like, this girl is going and looking out her window and just kind of hearing what he has to say, and she's kind of very confused. And so you eventually have her father come in and be like, what's going on here? It's like, is this some kind of prank? Elijah's like, no, sir. It's uh, like, I love your daughter, and I've always loved your daughter, and this and that. And ultimately, like, the father is just like, Nat, go home. And so basically, like, pretty much Nat just assumes that he's like, dude, I failed yet again at this. But then eventually, when he's kind of walking around through her house, like, the girl eventually kind of like winks at him or something at some other window, and he's like, yeah, maybe I did win her over. Maybe I was like stupidly, like, yeah, a little bit naive. I could have done this at any point in time, but like I don't think any time wouldn't have been the perfect time. So yeah, I guess that's a little sound off to have like both people at the end of Elijah eventually getting his gal in this movie, of Elijah's character, and eventually having Daniel eventually get his gal at the end of all this, uh, ultimately cementing that at some point in time it took Daniel's character to be frozen to ultimately finally get the happy ending that he wanted. So that's all I want to say about this review. Forever Young, who knows? I'm gonna go. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.